Hello guys, welcome to Story Cave, where every tale carries a lesson and every character mirrors something real in our own lives. If you're joining us for the first time, you're in for a journey through friendship, love, and the shadows that sometimes hide between them. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Now let's begin. She had always believed that friendship was the one constant in her unpredictable world. Sandra moved through the crowded streets of Victoria Island with a kind of quiet grace that made people look twice, not because she demanded attention, but because genuine warmth radiated from her like sunlight through clouds. Her laughter came easily, her trust even more so, and in the heart of Lagos's bustling professional district, she had built a modest life as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized firm. Nothing extravagant, nothing she hadn't earned through late nights and determined effort, but enough to make her proud. And through it all, there had been Judith, her best friend since their university days, her confidant, her sister in all but blood. Judith was different in ways that had once seemed complimentary. Where Sandra was soft-spoken, Judith commanded rooms with her presence. Where Sandra dressed in simple elegance, Judith favored bold colors and statement pieces that announced her arrival before she spoke a word. They had laughed about their differences over countless plates of jollof rice and fried plantain at their favorite spot in Lekki, had shared dreams and disappointments, had promised each other that no matter what life brought, their friendship would remain unshakable. But promises, Sandra would learn, are only as solid as the hearts that make them. The change began subtly, like the first drops of rain before a storm. It started the evening Sandra came home glowing with a secret she could barely contain, her phone clutched in her hand, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth that spoke of something precious and new. Judith noticed immediately. She always noticed everything about Sandra, and her eyes narrowed just a fraction before her own smile appeared, practiced and bright. "What's got you looking like you've swallowed the sun?" Judith asked, settling onto Sandra's worn sofa with the familiarity of someone who had occupied that space 1,000 times before. Sandra hesitated, suddenly shy, then let the words tumble out. "I met someone. His name is Adamu, and Judith, I think this might be something real." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, something fundamental shifted in the room. Judith's smile remained fixed, but her fingers tightened around her phone, knuckles briefly whitening before she forced them to relax. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice bright and interested, betraying nothing of the cold anger beginning to coil in her chest like a snake preparing to strike. So Sandra told her about Adamu's kindness, about how they had met at a corporate mixer, about his easy laugh and the way he actually listened when she spoke, about how he made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. She did not mention, because she did not yet know, that Adamu came from one of the wealthiest families in the north, that his last name opened doors and commanded respect across the country, that he represented everything Judith had spent years positioning herself to attract. Over the following weeks, as Sandra and Adamu's relationship blossomed, Judith watched from the sidelines with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She listened to Sandra's excited updates about dinner dates and long conversations, about meeting Adamu's friends, and how surprisingly normal everything felt despite his family's prominence. And with each story, each shared confidence, Judith felt the resentment growing inside her like a weed in fertile soil. Why Sandra? The question circled her mind during sleepless nights. What did Sandra have that she didn't? Sandra, with her simple life and modest ambitions, her gentle manner and unassuming presence, how had she captured the attention of someone like Adamu when Judith, who had carefully cultivated every aspect of herself to attract exactly this kind of man, remained overlooked? The breaking point came on a humid Saturday evening when Sandra invited Judith to her apartment, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. "He proposed," Sandra whispered, holding out her hand to display a ring that caught the evening lights streaming through the window, a ring that spoke of generosity and commitment in a future that suddenly seemed impossibly bright. Judith stared at the ring, at her friend's radiant face, and felt something inside her crack and splinter. She embraced Sandra, murmured congratulations, asked all the right questions about when and how and where, all while her mind raced with calculations and resentments. "Are you sure his family will accept you?" The question slipped out before Judith could stop it, wrapped in a tone of concern that concealed the poison beneath. Sandra's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" she asked, pulling back slightly to study her friend's face. Judith shook her head, manufactured a look of apologetic concern, reached out to squeeze Sandra's hand. I'm just worried for you, that's all. You know how these wealthy families can be, especially northern families with traditions and expectations. I don't want you to get hurt. But inside, Judith's thoughts ran darker and deeper. She was confident that being a northerner, Adamu would rather marry someone from his own region, someone from his social class. She did not expect a billionaire family to accept someone like Sandra, someone Judith had already labeled in her mind as beneath them both, a low life who had somehow stumbled into good fortune she had not earned and did not deserve. Adamu loves me, Sandra said softly, with a kind of simple faith that made Judith want to scream. His family has been nothing but welcoming. You've got this all wrong. But the seed had been planted, and Judith could see the small furrow of worry that appeared between Sandra's brows, the way her hand unconsciously moved to touch the ring as if to reassure herself of its solidity. Of course, Judith said quickly, forcing warmth back into her voice. I'm just being overprotective. You're right. I'm sure everything will be perfect. It's okay to feel nervous though, you know? Any bride would be. And Sandra relaxed, smiled again, pulled Judith into another hug, never suspecting that behind her back, her best friend's eyes had gone cold and calculating, already beginning to plot the destruction of everything Sandra held dear. The engagement party took place at an elegant rooftop venue in Ikoyi, where the Lagos skyline glittered like scattered jewels against the darkening sky, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and ambition. Sandra had worried about the extravagance, had suggested something smaller and more intimate, but Adamu's family had insisted, and she had eventually acquiesced with the grace that characterized everything she did. She moved through the crowd in a simple but elegant navy dress, her hand firmly clasped in Adamu's, her face luminous with happiness that seemed to radiate outward and touch everyone around her. Well, almost everyone. Judith arrived fashionably late, making an entrance in a form-fitting red dress that turned heads and announced her presence like a trumpet blast. She swept toward the couple with arms outstretched, embraced Sandra with theatrical warmth, kissed both her cheeks, and congratulated Adamu with a smile that lingered just a moment too long. You're a lucky man, she told him, her hand resting briefly on his arm, her eyes holding him with an intensity that made something flutter uncomfortably in Sandra's chest. But the moment passed quickly, and Judith was already moving on, working the room with the skill of someone who had studied social dynamics like a battlefield strategy. She laughed at the right moments, complimented the right people, and positioned herself always within Adamu's line of sight, a bright red beacon that demanded attention even in a room full of important guests. Throughout the evening, Judith played her role to perfection. She stood beside Sandra during the toasts, her arm around her friend's waist, her smile wide and genuine seeming as she raised her glass and declared to the assembled guests that no one deserved happiness more than her dear, sweet Sandra. But between the public declarations and the photo opportunities, Judith worked with subtle precision. She cornered Adamu's mother in a quiet moment by the dessert table, expressed her concern in hushed, worried tones. I love Sandra like a sister, she confided, her face the picture of conflicted loyalty, but I worry sometimes. She's had such a difficult past, you know, family troubles, trust issues. I just hope she's really ready for all of this. The words were vague enough to plant questions without making concrete accusations, and she watched with satisfaction as a small crease appeared on the older woman's forehead. Later, she found Adamu's younger brother, charming and impressionable, and painted a different picture entirely. Your brother is so patient, she said with an admiring smile. Sandra can be quite demanding sometimes, always wanting reassurance, always worried about not fitting in. But I suppose that's natural given the difference in your backgrounds. Each conversation was calibrated, each seed of doubt planted in different soil, all designed to create a garden of suspicion that would eventually bloom into something poisonous. And through it all, Sandra remained blissfully unaware, too caught up in her own joy to notice the careful architecture of her friend's betrayal being constructed around her like invisible walls. The real work began in the weeks following the engagement party. Judith made herself indispensable, volunteering to help with wedding preparations, offering to coordinate with vendors, suggesting she could be the bridge between Sandra's simple tastes and the family's expectations for a grand celebration. You've got this, she would tell Sandra during their planning sessions, her voice warm with encouragement even as her mind cataloged every detail, every vulnerability, every potential weakness she could exploit. She took note of Adamu's schedule, his habits, the times when he worked late at his family's construction company headquarters, the routes he took home. She learned which friends he trusted, which family members held influence, where the pressure points lay in his life. She also made certain to spend time with Adamu himself, always with plausible explanations. Sandra asked me to pick up her dress for the pre-wedding dinner, she would say, arriving at his office with a bright smile. I thought I'd save you the trip and drop it at your place since it's on my way. Or, Sandra is working late on that big campaign pitch, so I offered to help choose the cake design. You don't mind giving a second opinion, do you? Each interaction was brief and seemingly innocent, but Judith wielded them like tools, slowly building familiarity, establishing herself as helpful and trustworthy, someone who cared about the couple's happiness. Adamu, kind-hearted and unsuspecting, welcomed her involvement, even mentioned to Sandra how fortunate she was to have such a devoted friend. But beneath every helpful gesture, every generous offer, every reassuring word, Judith's resentment festered and grew. She would lie awake at night in her own apartment, staring at the ceiling, imagining the life that should have been hers. She pictured herself in Sandra's place, wearing that ring, planning that wedding, stepping into the role of Mrs. Adamu Bello with all the status and security and validation it represented. The unfairness of it consumed her like acid, eating away at whatever genuine affection she had once felt for her friend until nothing remained but hollow determination and the conviction that she deserved better, that the universe had made a mistake that she was entitled to correct. One evening, about 2 months before the planned wedding, Judith sat across from Sandra at their usual spot, picking at her rice while Sandra chattered excitedly about honeymoon destinations and Adamu's thoughtfulness in considering her preferences. Judith listened and nodded and made appropriate sounds of interest, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating and planning. The pieces were nearly in place. She had cultivated relationships with key members of Adamu's circle, had established herself as a constant presence in the couple's life, and had planted enough small doubts to create fertile ground for what would come next. Now she just needed the right moment, the right circumstances, and the courage to execute a plan so audacious that even she sometimes caught her breath at its boldness. "You're quiet tonight," Sandra observed, reaching across the table to touch Judith's hand. "Is everything okay? You've been so amazing through all of this. I hope I haven't been too wrapped up in wedding stuff to be a good friend to you." The genuine concern in Sandra's voice, the innocent trust in her eyes, might have given another person pause, might have inspired guilt or second thoughts. But Judith simply smiled, squeezed Sandra's hand, and lied with the ease of long practice. "I'm fine, just a little tired from work. And you could never be anything but a wonderful friend. I just want you to be happy." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but her expression remained warm and convincing. As they parted that night, embracing on the street corner before heading to their separate homes, Judith looked up at the sky and noticed the full moon hanging above them, bright and watchful. For a moment, something cold touched her spine, a feeling almost like being observed, being seen in a way that went beyond the physical. But she shook it off, attributed it to stress and late nights, and walked away from Sandra without looking back. She did not know, could not know, that some witnesses keep watch in silence, that some truths wait patiently in the dark, that the moon forgets nothing and eventually, inevitably, all secrets find their way into the light. The plan crystallized on a Tuesday afternoon when Adamu mentioned casually to Sandra that he would be working late at the construction site in Lekki, overseeing the final stages of a major project that had consumed weeks of his attention. Sandra, buried under her own deadlines at work, had simply kissed him goodbye and promised to have dinner waiting whenever he finished. She mentioned it to Judith during their daily phone call, the way friends do when sharing the mundane details of their lives, never imagining that she was handing her betrayer the weapon that would be used against her. Judith's heart had quickened with the recognition that this was the moment she had been waiting for. She spent the rest of that afternoon and evening preparing with meticulous care, choosing her outfit with strategic precision, a dress similar in color to one Sandra owned, subtle enough not to be obvious, but similar enough to create confusion in dim lighting or distant observation. She practiced her expressions in the mirror, the helpless damsel, the reluctant seductress, the innocent party caught in circumstances beyond her control. She rehearsed her lines, her explanations, the story she would tell when the pieces fell exactly as she intended them to fall. And as the sun set over Lagos and the moon began its ascent into the darkening sky, She set her plan into motion with the cold determination of someone who had convinced herself that the ends justified any means. She drove to the construction site just after 9 o'clock, when the workers had gone home, and only Adamu remained in the site office, reviewing blueprints and cost projections under the harsh fluorescent lights. She had called ahead, her voice bright and casual, explaining that Sandra had asked her to drop off some documents Adamu needed for an early morning meeting. A lie, but a plausible one. The kind of helpful gesture she had trained everyone to expect from her. Adamu had thanked her, told her the gate would be open, thought nothing of it, because why would he? Judith was Sandra's best friend, practically family already, someone he had come to trust and appreciate for her constant support of their relationship. When she arrived, Adamu looked up from his work with a tired smile, gesturing to the coffee pot in the corner. Long day, she asked sympathetically, setting down a folder she had filled with random papers that morning. You look exhausted. It's okay to take a break, you know. Even superheroes need to rest. She poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked, added sugar to his the way she had observed him take it during previous encounters, settled into the chair across from his desk with the ease of familiarity. They talked for a while about inconsequential things, the wedding timeline, the project deadline, mutual acquaintances, the kind of comfortable small talk that builds between people who orbit the same social sphere. Then Judith stood, moved around the desk under the pretense of looking at the blueprints spread across its surface, positioned herself close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Sandra is so lucky, she said softly, her voice taking on a different quality, something vulnerable and wistful that made Adamu glance at her with slight confusion. Not everyone finds what you two have found. She turned to face him, and in her eyes was something that made him instinctively take a step back. Want, need, calculation poorly disguised as emotion. Judith, he began, his voice uncertain, already sensing that something had shifted, that he needed to establish distance and clarity, but she moved faster than his words. She stumbled deliberately, her hand reaching out to catch herself against his chest, her body pressing close in what could have been an accident, but was choreographed as carefully as a dance. And in that moment, she triggered the second part of her plan, the phone she had positioned on the filing cabinet earlier, set to record, capturing the scene from an angle that would look damning to anyone who did not know the truth. Adamu caught her reflexively, his hands steadying her shoulders, and for perhaps 3 seconds they stood frozen in that tableau before he firmly set her away from him, his face hardening with understanding and disgust. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice cold now, all friendliness evaporated. "This is completely inappropriate. I think you should leave." But Judith was already moving to the final stage, her eyes filling with practiced tears, her voice breaking with manufactured emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I've had feelings for so long, and I thought maybe." She let the words trail off, watched his expression shift from disgust to uncomfortable pity, exactly as she had anticipated. Men like Adamu, good men raised with manners and respect, became uncertain and gentle when confronted with a woman's tears, even false ones. "You need to go," he repeated, but more softly now, already mentally composing how he would tell Sandra about this awkward situation, already dismissing it as a moment of poor judgment from an otherwise helpful friend, nothing more. Judith left, but not before retrieving her phone and sending a carefully edited version of the video to an anonymous number she had set up weeks earlier. The footage, trimmed and adjusted, showed only the moment of physical closeness, with none of the context before or after, none of Adamu's clear rejection or her manufactured stumble. To an observer seeing only those few seconds, it looked like an embrace, like intimacy, like betrayal. She sent it with a message calculated to wound. "Thought you should know what your fiancé does when you're not around." And she sent it to Sandra's phone, timing the delivery for maximum impact. Late enough that Sandra would be home and alone, tired from work, vulnerable to doubt and hurt. Sandra saw the message around 11 that night, her phone lighting up on the nightstand where she had dozed off waiting for Adamu to come home. She watched the video once, twice, 3 times, her heart constricting with each viewing, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. That was Adamu, unmistakably, and that was someone in his arms, and even though the footage was brief and the angle strange, the implication seemed clear enough to her exhausted, shocked brain. She called him immediately, her voice shaking, and his confusion at her accusations only seemed like guilt to her paranoid mind. "What are you talking about?" he kept asking, and his bewilderment read as defensiveness, his honest denials as calculated lies. The confrontation that followed was ugly and painful, words said in hurt and anger that could never be fully taken back. Sandra's insecurities, the ones Judith had carefully cultivated over months of subtle undermining, came flooding to the surface. Every doubt about whether she truly belonged in Adamu's world, every question about whether someone like him could really want someone like her, crystallized around that grainy video like poison around a seed. And when Adamu, hurt and frustrated by her refusal to believe him, finally said in exasperation, "If you can't trust me, then maybe we shouldn't be doing this," Sandra had removed her ring with trembling hands and left his apartment, her world crumbling around her like sand castles before the tide. Outside, the moon hung full and bright above the city, its light spilling silver across streets and rooftops, witness to betrayal and heartbreak, and the machinations of someone who had convinced herself that stealing another person's happiness was somehow justice. Judith, safely back in her own apartment, allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The first phase was complete. Now she just needed to be patient, to play the supportive friend consoling Sandra through her breakup, to position herself as the obvious alternative when Adamu inevitably sought comfort elsewhere. She had no guilt, no remorse, only the cold certainty that she had done what was necessary to claim what should have been hers from the beginning. The days following the breakup passed in a blur of pain and confusion for Sandra, each morning bringing the fresh shock of loss, each evening stretching into sleepless nights where she replayed every moment of her relationship with Adamu, searching for signs she had missed, warnings she had ignored. Judith was there through all of it. Of course, the devoted friend bearing witness to her suffering, bringing food that went uneaten, offering shoulders that absorbed countless tears, speaking words of comfort that tasted like honey but carried the bitterness of hidden triumph. "You deserve so much better," Judith would say, stroking Sandra's hair while internally celebrating each sob, each expression of devastation. "Some people aren't who we think they are. It's okay to feel broken right now, but you've got this. You're stronger than you know." But Sandra did not feel strong. She felt hollowed out, a shell of the person who had walked through the world just weeks earlier with such joy and certainty. The whispers started almost immediately, in her office, among mutual friends, throughout the social circles she and Adamu had occupied together. The story spread with the speed that scandals always do in Lagos's interconnected elite communities, growing and mutating with each retelling. Some versions painted her as the betrayed innocent, but others, carefully seeded by Judith's strategic conversations, suggested that perhaps Sandra had been unstable all along, too insecure to handle a relationship with someone of Adamu's caliber, too quick to believe rumors and create drama where none existed. The ambiguity of blame was perhaps worse than outright accusation. It left her suspended in a gray area of public opinion where truth became negotiable and reputation dissolved like sugar in rain. Adamu tried to reach her in those first weeks, his messages piling up unread, his calls going straight to voicemail. He sent flowers with notes proclaiming his innocence, tried to explain through mutual friends that nothing had happened, that there was some terrible misunderstanding. But Sandra could not bring herself to listen, could not reconcile the man she thought she knew with the image seared into her mind from that video. And gradually, as his attempts to contact her were met with silence, as Sandra made it clear through her complete withdrawal that she wanted nothing more to do with him, Adamu's efforts slowed and eventually stopped. He was hurt, confused, and increasingly angry at being convicted of something he had not done, at having his integrity questioned by someone he had loved and trusted completely. Into this void stepped Judith, no longer as the supportive friend, but as something more calculated and deliberate. She began appearing in places where she knew Adamu would be: the gym he frequented, the restaurant where he held business lunches, the charity events his family hosted. Each encounter seemed coincidental at first, but gradually a pattern emerged. She would offer sympathetic smiles, express her own confusion about what had happened between him and Sandra, position herself as the only person who understood both sides of the fractured relationship. "I don't know what got into her," Judith would say with perfectly calibrated sadness. "She hasn't been herself lately. I'm worried about her, but she won't listen to anyone." And slowly, methodically, she transformed herself in Adamu's eyes from his ex-fiancé's friend into a separate entity, someone who existed independently of Sandra, someone interesting and attractive in her own right. 6 months after the breakup, Judith and Adamu began dating. The news reached Sandra through the grapevine, delivered by a well-meaning former colleague who thought she should know, and it broke something in her that had been barely holding together. This was the final betrayal, the confirmation that her instincts had been correct all along. If Adamu could move on so quickly, and with her best friend no less, then clearly nothing between them had been real. She did not know, could not have known, that Judith had orchestrated every step of this outcome, had positioned herself as the consolation prize while ensuring that Sandra remained too broken to question the convenient timing of it all. The pain was devastating, but it also catalyzed something else. A determination not to let this destroy her completely, a stubborn refusal to remain trapped in the narrative others had written for her life. Sandra made a decision that required all the courage she had left. She would leave Lagos, leave the whispers and the memories and the constant reminders of everything she had lost. She applied for a position with an international marketing firm based in Accra, Ghana, and when they offered her the job, she accepted without hesitation. She packed her modest belongings, said goodbye to the few friends who had remained loyal through the scandal, and left Nigeria without fanfare or announcement. She did not tell Judith she was leaving. By then, the friendship had died naturally, killed by distance and Judith's new relationship and Sandra's inability to watch her former friend live the life that should have been hers. She simply disappeared, and the city that had witnessed her humiliation barely noticed her absence. In Accra, Sandra slowly rebuilt herself from the foundation up. The work was challenging and all-consuming, which was exactly what she needed. Long days that left no room for dwelling on the past, projects that demanded creativity and strategic thinking that reminded her she had value beyond her relationship status. She made new friends who knew nothing of her history, who saw only the competent professional and warm person she presented to them. She learned to laugh again, though the sound felt rusty at first and used. She discovered that heartbreak, while devastating, was not fatal, that people could survive the loss of what they thought was their future and find unexpected strength in the survival itself. It's okay to start over, she told herself on difficult days. It's okay to feel like you're building from nothing, because nothing is actually a foundation too, clean and uncluttered and full of possibility. Back in Lagos, Judith wore her victory like a crown. She had everything she had schemed for: Adamu's ring on her finger, his name soon to be hers, acceptance into the family and social circle she had coveted. The wedding was planned for the following spring, even grander than the one that had been intended for Sandra, and Judith moved through the preparations with smug satisfaction. She had won. She had identified what she wanted, executed a plan to obtain it, and succeeded beyond her initial hopes. That she had destroyed a friendship and built her happiness on lies seemed irrelevant to her. In Judith's worldview, life was a competition where only results mattered, and she had simply played the game more skillfully than her opponent. But there were moments, usually late at night, when Adamu slept beside her and the city lay quiet beyond their bedroom window, when Judith would find herself unable to sleep, troubled by something she could not quite name. She would rise and stand at the window, looking out at the Lagos skyline, and sometimes she would notice the moon hanging in the sky like a watchful eye. Those nights made her uncomfortable in ways she could not articulate, as if something vast and patient was observing her, waiting for something, keeping accounts she had forgotten existed. She would shake off the feeling, return to bed, convince herself it was just wedding stress or work pressure or the normal anxieties that came with major life changes. She did not understand that some debts accumulate silently, that truth has its own timeline, and that the moon, ancient and constant, forgets nothing and eventually demands that all accounts be settled. 5 years can transform a person in ways both visible and hidden, and when Sandra stepped off the plane at Murtala Mohammed International Airport on a humid Friday afternoon, she was barely recognizable as the heartbroken woman who had fled Lagos half a decade earlier. She had returned for business. Her company was expanding into the Nigerian market, and as their West African regional director, she was leading the charge. Her success had been hard-won but undeniable. She carried herself now with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced her worst fear and survived it, who had learned that she could build a life on her own terms without needing external validation to prove her worth. The pain of the past had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something else: wisdom, perhaps, or simply the understanding that some chapters close for reasons we only comprehend much later. She had not intended to encounter anyone from her old life. Lagos was a city of over 20 million people, after all, and she planned to keep her visits strictly professional. Meetings with potential clients, site visits to advertising agencies, dinners with business contacts who had no connection to her personal history. But fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, had other plans. On her second evening in the city, she attended a corporate gala at the Eco Hotel, a networking event where companies showcased their services and professionals mingled over champagne and canapes. And there, across a crowded ballroom glittering with chandeliers and ambition, she saw him. Adamu looked older, which was natural, but also tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. He stood with a group of business associates, nodding at their conversation but not fully engaged, his eyes occasionally drifting around the room with an expression that might have been searching or might have been simply empty. For a moment, Sandra considered leaving, slipping out before he noticed her, preserving the peace she had worked so hard to cultivate. But before she could move, their eyes met across the distance, and she watched recognition dawn on his face. Shock first, then something complicated and painful that she could not quite identify. He excused himself from his group and began moving toward her, and she found herself rooted in place, her heart pounding but her face composed, waiting. "Sandra," he said when he reached her, and her name in his voice after so many years carried the weight of everything unsaid, everything unresolved. "I heard you were doing well. Regional director. That's impressive." They made small talk for a few minutes, the conversation awkward and formal, two people who had once known each other's dreams and fears now struggling to find common ground. But then Adamu said something that made her pause. "I want you to know, whatever you think happened that night, whatever you believe about me, it wasn't true. Nothing happened with Judith. She staged it, manipulated both of us, and by the time I understood what she had done, you were gone and wouldn't speak to me." Sandra felt something twist in her chest, old wounds threatening to reopen. "Adamu, I don't think," she began. But he interrupted, his voice urgent now, as if words he had held for 5 years were finally breaking free. "She confessed, Sandra. 3 years into our marriage, during an argument, she finally admitted what she did. The video was edited, staged. She deliberately created that situation and sent it to you knowing exactly how it would look. I divorced her 2 years ago." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and the bitter taste of time wasted, opportunities lost, futures stolen by someone's calculated malice. Before Sandra could respond, before she could process this information that rewrote everything she thought she understood about her past, there was a commotion near the entrance. Heads turned, conversations paused, and into the ballroom walked Judith, dressed expensively but looking somehow diminished, her face harder than Sandra remembered, her eyes scanning the crowd with something like desperation. She had not been invited to this event. Security would later confirm that she had talked her way past the front desk using an old business card and sheer audacity. And when her eyes found Sandra standing with Adamu, her expression shifted through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, fear, defiance, and finally something that might have been resignation. But Judith was not the only unexpected arrival. Behind her, moving with quiet authority, came a woman Sandra recognized as Chioma, one of Adamu's cousins, someone who had been kind to her during the engagement, someone who had always seemed too observant, too thoughtful to miss the undercurrents in any situation. Chioma held a tablet in her hands, and her face was grim as she approached the small group forming around Sandra and Adamu. "I think it's time everyone knew the truth," Chioma said, her voice carrying clearly despite the ambient noise of the gala. "I've kept this quiet for too long, respecting family privacy, but enough is enough." What Chioma revealed, there in front of a growing audience of curious onlookers, was something she had discovered years earlier but had been pressured to keep silent about. Security camera footage from the construction site, footage that showed Judith's arrival that fateful night, showed her setting up her phone to record before approaching Adamu, showed the entire encounter from an angle that made the truth undeniable. She had stumbled deliberately, had pressed herself against him despite his clear attempt to maintain distance, and had retrieved her phone with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan had succeeded. Chioma had found this footage during the divorce proceedings while helping Adamu document his assets, and had kept it as insurance. But seeing Sandra tonight, seeing the possibility of closure and justice, she had decided that some secrets deserved to be exposed. The silence that followed was absolute. Judith stood frozen, her carefully constructed facade crumbling as everyone in the immediate vicinity now understood exactly what she had done, How she had destroyed two people's happiness for her own gain. How she had built her brief marriage on a foundation of lies and manipulation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice thin and desperate, but no one wanted to hear her explanations, her justifications for the unjustifiable. Security was already moving toward her, and as they escorted her from the building, Sandra watched her go with emotions too complex to name. Anger certainly, but also something like pity for someone who had poisoned her own life with envy and still ended up with nothing. In the aftermath, as the gala slowly resumed its normal rhythm and the gossip spread like wildfire through Lagos's social networks, Sandra and Adamu stood together in a quiet corner of the balcony, looking out over the city lights that stretched to the horizon. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for not fighting harder to make you believe me, for not finding that footage sooner, for letting you leave thinking I had betrayed you." Sandra shook her head, surprised to find tears on her cheeks, but not tears of sadness. Something else, something like release. "We were both victims of someone else's cruelty," she said. "And maybe we both needed these 5 years to become who we were meant to be." They talked through the night. Not about reconciliation. Too much time had passed. They were different people now with different lives. But about forgiveness. About letting go of the weight they had both carried for so long. About finding peace with a past they could not change. And overhead, the moon hung bright and full, its light spilling silver across the city. The same moon that had witnessed Judith's betrayal years earlier. The same moon that had kept silent watch while truth waited for its moment. Some things, they both understood now, cannot be hidden forever. Darkness may conceal for a season, but light always returns, and the patient witnesses of the universe keep accounts that eventually demand to be balanced. As dawn broke over Lagos, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sandra felt something inside her finally settle into place. Not happiness exactly, but something better. Wholeness, the understanding that she had survived the worst and emerged stronger, that her worth had never been dependent on someone else's validation or someone else's betrayal. She flew back to Accra 2 days later, carrying with her not the burden of unresolved pain, but the lightness of closure, the gift of knowing that sometimes the long journey away from heartbreak is exactly what shapes us into the people we were always meant to become. And so our story ends, dear friends, with a truth as old as time itself, that what we do in secret, thinking no one sees, is never truly hidden. The moon, the stars, the universe itself bears witness, and eventually, all things hidden find their way to light. Judith learned too late that happiness stolen never satisfies, that foundations built on lies inevitably crumble. But Sandra learned something more valuable, that we are stronger than our breaking points, that new beginnings are always possible, and that sometimes the greatest gift is not the love we thought we lost, but the person we become while finding our way back to ourselves. Remember this always. Choose kindness over envy, truth over manipulation, and trust that your own blessings will come in their time without needing to steal someone else's joy. Thank you for joining us at Story Cave today. If this story touched your heart or taught you something valuable, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel so you never miss a tale, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted? How did you heal? We'd love to hear your stories. Until next time, may your path be lit with truth and your heart be filled with grace.